Welcome to my home video interview studio. This week, in addition to my day job, I am interviewing some folks out in Hollywood who have included the sport of ride and tie in their movies and in their television shows and things. And so I've got this kind of indoor home studio set up, and I thought I'd use it because the lighting is nice and whatnot for our Bible study for today. So excuse my attire and the ride and tie thing. This is not a ride and tie interview. This is our Bible lesson for the week of March 19. And we are beginning today a series of 3 lessons on the 25th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. And I would say that Matthew 25 is maybe the most challenging, even the most scary, but also, I would hope, the most encouraging chapter, maybe in the whole Bible. And as we go through these next 3 weeks and look at the 3 parables that are in that chapter, I think we will see that and discover that for ourselves, I hope. But before we get to today's parable, I want to tell you a story that relates to the parable. A number of years ago, Lee's family was all spending the week after Christmas together in a home in the mountains of North Carolina. And we decided late one afternoon to do a hike. And so we were going to hike up to the top of this mountain and then hike back down, of course, and then head on home. And we hiked up to the top of the mountain, and it was just wonderful. But the hike was a little more than we planned, as is often the case. And as we began to make our way back down the mountain, the sun was setting fast, and then the sun set. And of course, in the mountains, oftentimes, if the sun sets behind the mountain, it gets even darker more quickly. And it turns out that of the 8 or 9 of us who were hiking, only one, Lee's brother Danny, had a flashlight. And Lee's brother Danny is one of the most well-prepared people that I know. And of course, he had a flashlight, but none of the rest of us did. And so 9 or 10 of us are trying to hike in the dark on a very rocky, uneven trail that's pretty steep, using just the one flashlight. And thank goodness that Danny had one, or I don't know what we would have done. A year or 2 later, I was on a backpacking trip with Danny. We were in the Grand Canyon. And late one afternoon, we'd already made our camp for the night, we decided to hike out, 2 or 3 of us, to a plateau so we could watch the sunset. And so we hike out onto this plateau, maybe a mile or so from our camp, and we watch the sunset, and then we turn around and we're headed back to camp, and Danny says to me, "Courtney, do you have a flashlight?" And I said, "No, I forgot to bring one." And anyway, I knew my big brother-in-law, Danny, would have a flashlight for me. And he did. And so for another hike, I had to rely on Danny and his preparedness because of my lack of preparedness. Well, Jesus would warn me and does warn me in this parable that we can only rely so much on other people and only so long on other people that we need to be prepared ourselves. And so let me share with you Matthew 25, 1 through 13, this very familiar parable. "Then the kingdom of heaven," Jesus says, "will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with the lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, 'Look, here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him.' Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise replied, 'No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves.' And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids came also, shouting, 'Lord, Lord, open to us.' But he replied, 'Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour.'" I want to begin by kind of setting this parable about preparation in context. I've shared with you before, Kenneth Bailey is a minister and author, and he grew up in the Middle East and spent a number of years in the Middle East, and he often can help us by setting parables or stories in their context. And he says that in that day, and even to this day, in Middle Eastern towns, particularly in villages where kind of everybody knows everybody, weddings often take place at the at the groom's house. But they don't begin at his house, they begin at the bride's house. And so most of the party will assemble at the bride's house, and at the appointed time when she is completely all decked out in her wedding attire, she will appear, and they'll take her and place her on an animal, a donkey or a colt or something, and then together the groom and the bride will make their way with the whole wedding party to the groom's house. Now, this is often going to happen at night, and they're going to make their way through the village on a kind of meandering route, sort of waking up the whole village so that everyone can celebrate. And as people come out, they will shout out blessings. They may even have gifts to offer to them as they make their way on this parade to go all the way to the groom's house. Meanwhile, back at the groom's house, there are a few people who will be there waiting, perhaps preparing for not only the wedding, but the banquet that will follow. In the parable that Jesus tells, there are some bridesmaids who are there with their lamps. And part of what we can imagine, that they are there sort of as human illuminaria, maybe 5 on one side and 5 on the other side, to light the pathway up to the groom's house. Bailey also says that young women in the Middle East, both in that time and interestingly to me in this day as well, if they're going to be out after dark, they often want to have a light. And of course they want to have a light for the same reason that my brother-in-law Danny wants to have a light so they can find their way around. But also they want to have a light because if they're wandering around in the dark without a light and someone is able to see them by the light of the moon or see them go into a house or whatever, they might say, now what is she up to? Why is she slinking around here in the darkness? And it's also the case, Bailey says, that if they have a light, it is a protection for them because if someone will want to harass them or do them some harm, they'll have to do it in the light where others can see, and can see not only the young woman, but whoever it is that might be trying to do her some harm. And so it is a protection for them. So here are these 10 maidens, and they're out waiting for this bridegroom to come, but the party or the parade is delayed. They're taking a lot longer time making their way through the town, and all 10 of them fall asleep, and they leave their lamps burning. Now, as we just heard, that was not the foolish part, because they need to have their lights burning as young women out after dark. And yet the foolish part is that at midnight, a cry goes up, "Look! The bridegroom is coming," and they all get up and have to trim their wicks and get the lights to burn again. And really, all 10 realize that their lamps are almost out of oil. 5 have brought flasks of oil so they can refill their lamps, but 5 have not. And the ones who have not, of course, are in trouble. And so they holler out to their friends, their sisters, "Give us some of your oil." But the sisters said, "We only have enough for ourselves. You need to go to the oil merchants and buy some there." Now, never mind that at midnight it's probably going to be pretty hard to find an oil merchant shop who is open. Bailey does say that in a small village, everybody knows everybody, and they could either go and borrow or buy oil from almost anybody. But whether the merchants are open or not, that's not the 5 wise maidens' problem. That's the problem for the 5 foolish ones. And so they go off to buy the oil, and of course, while they're gone, the wedding party arrives, the parade arrives, everyone goes inside, the door is shut, the wedding is in full swing when the maidens come back, and they knock on the door and they yell out, hey, let us in, let us in. And the bridegroom says, "Look, I don't even know who you are. You're not coming in to my wedding." And this is another parable that doesn't really end, and we'll get to that at the very end of this study of this lesson. But before we get there, I want to, as a way of going through this lesson, I want to ask a few questions about this parable and offer you answers that scholars and others might give to us. And the first question I have is, what day and hour is Jesus talking about when he says, "Keep awake, for you don't know what the day or the hour is"? And of course, this parable is told in the context of the parable we studied last week as well, about the great wedding banquet that the king gives for his son. And we know that Jesus is the bridegroom, and the Jewish Messiah was often referred to as a bridegroom. Jesus, particularly in the book of Revelation, is referred to as the bride, and we in heaven are all coming to the wedding of the Lamb, and it's one of the analogies, the metaphors that we have for heaven. And no doubt that is what Jesus is talking about, and the other two parables in this chapter refer to the same thing. The second coming of Christ, when Christ comes and all of creation is brought into the great wedding banquet of the Lamb. But I want to suggest that it's not just this great big global thing, but it is that there will come many times in our lives where we have either an opportunity or a challenge to allow the gospel to work in and through us. But if we are not prepared, we're not going to be able for that to happen. There have been a couple of times in my life where I faced pretty severe crises. And during a couple of those times I discovered that I really have more steel in my spine maybe than I thought that I might. That my integrity stood up when everything around me was screaming to let my integrity go. And what that suggests to me is not that I am a superior person, because I'll mention in a minute there's been other times when that hasn't happened, but that for those two particular times in my life, I had done the preparation that I needed to do, not knowing that a crisis was coming. But I was prayed up, if you will. I had been studying. I had been trying to live the life that Christ wanted me to live. Trying to connect myself to Christ so that when the crisis came, I was able to do what I needed to do. Now, there have been other times in my life, as there have been for all of us, when I wasn't prepared. Oftentimes for me that has been when I've tried to rely on my own strength or my own ingenuity instead of relying on the strength of Christ or Christ's wisdom. And it's at those times that I've made a complete mess of things. There are times, I'm sure for all of us, when we are like the wise bridesmaids, and other times when we are like the foolish ones. But Jesus is really warning us here then that we have to constantly be adding to our spiritual bank account, if you will. It's too late once the crisis comes to go out and find the oil that we need. It's too late when you're coming down the mountain and the sun sets to be able to find a flashlight. You have to be prepared ahead of time. And being prepared ahead of time for us means, as Christians, that we have to engage in daily prayer. We have to worship and fellowship with other Christians, allow other Christians to help shape us into who Christ wants us to be. We have to find avenues of service and witness. So when that time of challenge or when that opportunity arises, we are prepared and will have the resources that we need. Another way of looking at it is it's too late to buy insurance when the catastrophe happens. If I don't have fire insurance and my house burns down, I can't go to the company and buy fire insurance then. It's too late. So Jesus is saying be prepared. And that's going to be on a daily kind of way, adding to our spiritual bank account, if you will, so that we'll have the resources that we need to have when we need them. Another question I think that is a wonderful question and has a delightful answer in this parable is, who are those 10 maidens supposed to represent? Ibn al-Tayyib was a 10th century Syrian Orthodox monk. So he was truly a millennial. He lived in the 1000s. And he noted, I think this is just so fascinating, that in that day and age, and even this day and age, for a small town or a village to have a synagogue, they had to have 10 faithful Jewish men agree to come together and form that synagogue. And he said that it actually even took 10 men to have a wedding. You had to bring those 10 elders together in order to have a proper Jewish wedding. And he said that he thinks Jesus chose 10 young women to say that these are the church. And of course the church is often described as the bride of Christ. And so these 10 women are the church who are gathered together to be a part of the wedding of the bride of the church, or excuse me, the groom of the church. They are there as we will be there. And then we then have to recognize that we can't give this parable away. This isn't about people who aren't a part of the church. This is about the church. And so this is saying that there's a warning here for us, that we as the church have to make sure that we are wise members of the church, or not foolish, because there are implications for us if we are not wise members of the church. Some people believe, well, as long as I can say that, going back to that insurance thing, well, I took out an insurance policy, I took out fire insurance years ago, and now it just sits on the shelf, and I don't need to do anything with it until I need it. When I need to get into heaven, I'll have my policy, and I can cash in the policy. But that's not what the Christian life is all about. And if we are not preparing ourselves, we will not be prepared. If we're not allowing Christ to strengthen us on a daily basis, we will not be prepared when the crisis comes, whether it is a crisis in this life or even when that banquet of the Lamb comes for us and we have that opportunity to come in. If we aren't there, we can't take it. Third question, I think, an important one, is why didn't the other maidens share their oil? After all, aren't we supposed to share? And the answer here is that yes, of course, we are supposed to share our resources, but there's some things we can't share. My brother-in-law, Danny, can share his flashlight as best he can with 2 or 3 of us, or 10 of us, 9 or 10 of us, however many it was on that hike. But he can't share his integrity or his resolve or his grace. You can't give to me those things if I need them. Those are things that Christ has to build up in me. And if I don't have them, then I can't borrow them from you. It's not that you wouldn't be willing to share them with me. I can't borrow them. I have to have my own spiritual resources. And that is what Jesus is warning us about, but also encouraging us in this parable to develop. I think that leads to a question the parable really asks of us, and that is, are we in this for the long haul or not? The 5 foolish maidens were in it, but they weren't in it for the long haul. And so when more was required of them, you need to be prepared. They were not prepared. I connect this really to the parable that we studied a few weeks ago, the parable of the sower. And some of the seeds fall on rocky soil and they immediately spring up. They want to be a part. They want to be there, but they can't let their roots go deep. The rocky soil keeps their roots from being able to go deep. And when the sun comes out, when the crisis comes, they wither and they fall. And that's exactly what this parable is warning us about as well. We need to have those resources that we're going to need, because we never know when the shout will come. Look, here comes the bridegroom. We never know when the challenge might happen, and we need to be prepared for the challenge. And finally, I want to end with the question that I kind of alluded to earlier, and that is, what happens to these people in the parable after the parable ends? And like so many of Jesus' parables, this one actually doesn't have an ending. That seems to have an ending. The foolish ones knock on the door and they say, please let us in. And the bridegroom says, sorry, I don't know who you are. And that seems to be the end. But Bailey notes that in the Middle East, no is always the beginning of a negotiation. The Middle East has much more of a bargaining culture than we tend to in the West. And so when the bridegroom initially says no, that's just opening up the door for more bargaining. Bailey noted that these foolish maidens are very demanding. They're demanding of their sisters, give us some more oil. And the sisters say, no, we can't do that. We can't give you that. They demand of the bridegroom, let us in. We want to come in too. Now what happens in the bargaining when the bridegroom says no? Well, it could be that the foolish maidens bargain all the harder or all the more demanding. No, it's not fair. We waited for you and you were late. We waited for you and you weren't there. And then we had to go out and get oil. This is all your fault, so you have to let us in. Well, if they respond that way, how will the bridegroom respond? And my guess is probably not too positively. But what if they respond with repentance and with confession? And what if they say, we were foolish. We just didn't bring enough oil. We weren't thinking ahead, and we are so sorry, but we want to be in your presence, and we want to be a part of your celebration, and we want to be a part of your wedding. Won't you let us in, even though we admit how foolish we were? Now, when we ask Christ for forgiveness, we know what Christ tends to do, but we really don't know how the bridegroom might have responded if they responded in that way. And so I'd like to leave us with this thought. Since we don't know how the bridegroom might respond if we are not prepared, whether we demand to be let in anyway, or whether we beg forgiveness and respond in confession and repentance, maybe instead we should just be wise and do all that we can to be prepared. We can do all of these things, of course, because the bridegroom, Jesus Christ, is with us.